If you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that for my currently inked videos, I have a web form where I ask people to go to submit questions for future episodes. And every now and again, I get a question in from that form that I feel deserves a little bit more attention than just a quick answer in a currently inked or Q&A video. And the question from Andy, who is at UC Santa Barbara, is one of those. Now, again, if you've watched my videos a lot, one of the things you've probably heard me talk about quite a bit are the nibs from a Spanish company called fpnibs.com. fpnibs.com has access to stock nibs from Yovo, and also they have Aurora nibs and TWSBI nibs where you can buy additional nibs for your pens. But one of the things that makes FP Nibs different is that the gentleman who runs the site is quite an accomplished nibmeister. And so in addition to getting these these screw-in nib units where you can just put them in your pens, he will also do a fair bit of work to grind them into stubs or italics or cursive italics. He will grind them to fine or extra fine, extra fine, extra fine, needlepoint, obliques, all of that kind of stuff. He's got variations in, different kinds of gold content, different kinds of plating. And so there's a lot of options there for someone who wants to replace a nib in one of their other pens. And they've kind of become my go-to place for buying additional nibs. Not only I can get stock Yovo nibs from I can get Yovo nibs from a lot of manufacturers, even here in the States. But I keep going back to FP Nibs because the nibs I get from them seem to be just of much higher writing quality to the way I like to write. One of the things that makes FP Nibs a little different, and one of the things that's harder to find is they will do some work on your nibs to give them additional flexibility. So they take 14K gold, number 6 Yovo nibs, and we'll grind away the edges and make some adjustments to the nib to make them available for flex. Now, there are a few folks who will do that here in the US. Richard Binder, the nibmeister, has nibs that are available through, I believe it's Edison, with additional flex. You can take your pens to someone like John Modishaw or his team at nibs.com and have additional flex added that way. But adding flex is not something that even most nibmeisters do. And I have yet to meet anyone who has done a better job at it than fpnibs.com. So I've got 2 fpnibs.com semi-flex nibs. I'm going to walk you through a couple of the differences and tell you about the pluses and minuses, because as we all know, in this community, flex is life. We're crazy about our flex. So I've got two custom, one custom and one production pen here. This is my Idyll, I-D-Y-L-L, not I-D-L-E, from Scriptorium Pens, made out of Conway Stewart evergreen acrylic, and it has a little bronze. I forget what metal I asked this to be made out of. I believe it's bronze roll stopper here. And then I have this Kanilea Kahakai. Now, this came with a steel nib. I replaced it with this FP Nibs nib. This did not come with a nib. I requested it without a nib because I knew I was going to be putting an FP Nibs nib in here. So we'll go ahead and start with the Kahakai. So this is the nib, and I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it on the video. I may try to zoom in here, and if I don't, it's because I couldn't. But this is a blank Yovo nib. There's no decoration on the front at all. It's got a round breather hole, but it is a 14-karat gold nib. This came to me as a fine. It was very wet, however, so I took it to a pen show and had Dan Smith of nibsmith.com grind it down to an extra fine. He took it a little bit further in extra fine than I think I wanted, but he gave me what I asked for, but what I asked for was not what I think I wanted in the end. So if I had to do over again, I probably wouldn't have it ground down quite so far. So let me show you a little bit about how this writes. I've put the same ink in both of these pens. Now, I will give you fair warning. These pens have been inked with ink for a while, almost 2.5 months, almost 3 months at this point. So they've been, I really do need to clean them out, but I wanted to do this review before I clean them out because I don't want to wash a bunch of ink down the sink unless I have to. So there may be a little bit of ink flow issue. I'll call that out. It's generally not a problem with these nibs. I just think that the ink has been in there for so long that it's probably a little more concentrated than usual. In any case, here is the Semiflex FP Nibs nib that has been ground to an extra fine. And I'm going to pull my head out of the frame here and show you. So you can see you get some decent flexibility here, but it's not as much as you might hope for. One of the things that I think has made this flexibility stand out to me a little bit more is that the unflexed line is quite fine. It's a very, very fine nib. And you can push this pretty far. It also handles the ink flow very well. And this is one of the things I find fascinating about these FP nibs is JoWo's feeds have a very, very small ink channel in them. They struggle to keep up with a wet ink flow, particularly, boy, I'm having trouble speaking today, particularly if you are using them with a broad or very wet nib or with a converter. And this is, in fact, running off of a standard international converter. I did not eyedropper this pen. But you'll notice that it does hold up pretty well. Now, I am going slow, which I almost always do when I flex. I don't flex fast. It's not really, if I'm going to do flex writing, I want it to be pretty. And so, but you'll notice on the flex when I, I'll do this little loopy here. Watch what happens when I start to lift. So it's kind of dry, then I lift up, and you see how the ink shoots back up that channel again? So this nib gives me some really neat shading and sheening because there's this kind of in-between spot right when I'm at the end of the flex where it drops an extra chunk of ink on the page and the ink kind of shoots back up the channel of where you've written before. So you get some really interesting interaction there. The other thing that makes flex interesting for a lot of people is what I have started calling snapback. And that is the amount of pressure that the metal of the nib puts to bring itself back to home. Vintage nibs, a lot of vintage nibs, are very, very responsive. They, you don't have to push really hard to get flex, but they snap back home very quickly. And that's one of the things that makes vintage flex nibs. That's one of the things that I've yet to see a modern manufacturer who's been able to get the kind of flex performance you get on a vintage nib and maintain that kind of snapback. Usually they tend to be spongy or very soft or kind of sluggish in returning to the home position. This particular version of the nib is actually quite responsive. You get some decent flow or some decent line variation, actually some pretty good line variation, but it's very snappy. It comes back home pretty quickly. It is one of the closest I have found to a really, really good vintage nib in a modern nib. And it's not something that I've seen accomplished often. So that's one of the things I really like about these nibs is they perform very well. Now let's switch to the other pen. And this is where things start to get a little interesting. So one of the options when you buy a Semiflex nib from fpnibs.com is you can have an additional work done on the breather hole. You can either have it drilled out into a heart shape, which is very common for a lot of vintage flex nibs, or in this particular case, and I don't know how well you'll be able to see it under this light, a keyhole, which is also very common for vintage flex nibs. The keyhole nib does something completely changes the writing characteristics, because what you'll see is, I'm going to put these side by side here. When they are right next to each other, the keyhole or the hole is at the same spot, but by extending the keyhole down further, you're actually lengthening the flexible parts of the tines. And that really does give a different feel to the nib. It is much softer, much more flexible, a lot wetter in my opinion. And it also, but you lose a little bit of that snappy responsiveness that the other nib has. So it depends on what you like and what you want out of your nib, but that's the other thing. The other thing I'll call out is, I think I mentioned this, but on both the nibs, he actually shaves down the shoulders a little bit to give the tines, to thin out the tines a little bit and make them more flexible. So let me show you how this one writes. And this one's a special nib for me. So here's unflexed. It's a fine nib, and it's a nice, nice fine. But watch what happens when I start to flex. And you'll notice this one does tend to railroad a little bit more, and I have to get it going often. It doesn't like to be sitting down for a while, but it's really a nice flex. There we go. Now it seems to be running. So I'm going to go slowly here and write my first name. I mean, look at that line variation. It's pretty awesome. It does not require a lot of downward force. This is this is not a wet noodle nib. You'll hear that term a lot in flex world. This is not a wet noodle nib, but it is as close to a full flex wet noodle nib as I have seen from any modern manufacturer, and by a pretty significant margin. I have taken this nib to pen shows for the last 3 pen shows I went to. I took this pen and this nib with me and have passed it around the table, and almost without fail, someone picks up the pen, they write with it, and they said, "Where did you get this nib again?" And the next thing I know, they've got one in one of their pens. If you know how to write with a flex nib, if you like flex nibs, this is, in my opinion, the best modern equivalent for a semi-flex / flex nib. It's wonderful. And to prove it, I'm going to write the word. Wonderful. And this is very sloppy because I am sitting at the wrong angle. Also, I'm not great with flex writing. I'm better at it than I used to be, but I'm still not great at it. I want to get a nib like this into the hands of like Aziza or something like that from Gourmet Pens, and let her or Leigh Reyes or someone go with it, because it's really nice. Nice wet flow. You still get that shading. You can see it here. So overall, these fpnibs.com nibs are among my favorites. Fortunately, JoWo No. 6 nibs are among the most commonly used in pens under $200. So you can get a pen for $150 from Keras. Well, Keras uses Bock nibs, but from Franklin Christoph, from Edison. I'm trying to think of who else uses JoWo No. 6 nibs. There's a bunch of people out there, and for some reason, they're just not clicking in my head. JoWo nibs also will work in a lot of the Chinese brands that use No. 6 nibs. So, like, for example, the Jinhao X450 or X750 or the 159. Those all use JoWo No. 6 nibs, or they use No. 6 nibs, and you can swap out JoWo nibs in them. Goulet Pens makes No. 6 nibs. Monteverde can use No. 6 nibs. So you've really got a lot of options if you want to play around with some really nice flex, but not worry about having to buy a vintage pen. So FP Nibs did not sponsor this. They have not paid me. I have spent a lot of money with them over the last little while because I really, really like these nibs. I like nibs with bounce and flex, and these are among some of my favorites. So, Andy, hopefully that was good enough to give you a little bit of an overview of the fpnibs.com nibs, and head over to their website, see what they got. The prices are really quite reasonable, and I think you'll enjoy what you see there if you're looking for modern flex. So thank you so much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you here soon on another video. Take care.